comments he would say to the waitresses and stuff would shock you. But he had a heart of gold, and he really loved to fish. And I think if Jake had to crawl out to the river to fish, he would certainly do it.
Bring up that hook point, though.
And then there's this guy here too. This is Jim Corbin, who's with us as well. And we have a lot of respect and admiration for Jim. And he's the guy that taught us how to build our first fishing rods. And that was something really really special for us. And even to this day, we still ask Jim lots of questions. And later on in the presentation, Doug and I are going to be talking a little bit about rod design. I don't think we'd be here doing that if we had never met Jim. So he's really been a great teacher and a friend, and I can't, we were really thankful that we had the opportunity to meet Jim through the fishing club.
Thank you.
And as kids, we also met Barry and Kathy Beck, and they had a very good, big influence on us as well. And we unfortunately lost Kathy last week. They were down in Argentina fishing, and she unexpectedly passed away. But we met Barry and Kathy when we took fly fishing school from them when we were 15, and soon after that we actually started time flies commercially for them. And so they really had a real big impact on us as kids. As I mentioned, we started time for Barry and Kathy, and soon after that we would start saving our pennies, each winter, and taking the summers off and fishing the beloved limestone and freestone streams in Pennsylvania. We did that every summer until we were, I think it was 21 or so. And occasionally we catching, wild brown trout like this. But we weren't also above fishing some of the smaller limestone gems and catching what the locals call natives, even though these little brown trout, or these little wild brown trout, are actually indigenous to these rivers. But as we got a little older, our attention turned to fishing out west. And we asked Barry and Kathy about it, and they recommended that we send some resumes out to some of the fly shops in West Yellowstone and Livingston. And one of the shops that wanted to hire us was Blue River Flies. And I think that we were pretty lucky to go to work there during our summer breaks from college. And at the time, it was owned by Craig Matthews and Jackie Matthews and John Jursek. And I'll tell you what, these guys are incredible fishermen, fly tyers, casters. So we really learned a lot from these guys, and just such a good experience as young anglers, and they really opened our eyes to the fishing that was in the area. So pretty lucky. And those of you that don't know these guys, they are the originators of the X-Caddis and the Sparkle Dud, and actually they sell or designer tires for Umpqua, and they've actually sold more flies than any other people in the industry for Umpqua. So when most people think of the Yellowstone area, they think about Old Faithful here, or the picturesque landscapes, or even the abundant wildlife in the area. But for us, it's all about the fishing, whether it's catching a beautiful cutthroat trout from the Yellowstone River or a whopper brown from the Madison River. So Doug and I routinely fish about 100 days a year, which is, not too bad for two working stiffs like us. But despite all this fishing, we actually managed to meet two pretty girls. This is my wife, Annabelle, on the left, and Doug's wife, Brandy, on the right. And guess what? Both of them fish. And no slideshow would be complete without a couple of big fish pictures from the girls. This is Brandy with a nice cut from the Yellowstone. And my wife, Annabelle, with a nice one Indian bonefish. I tell you, we really got lucky with these. Sometimes I don't know how we actually did it. And we even decided to, buy a house down in West Yellowstone, which I didn't actually mention earlier, but it's about an hour and a half away um, from Bozeman. So we bought a summer home down there, and we spend almost every single weekend of the year fishing in West Yellowstone. And I'll tell you, this is a great place for fishing because there's actually more than 2,000 miles of rivers and streams within a 100-mile radius of West Yellowstone. And that doesn't even count all the hundreds of ponds and lakes and so forth. So it's a fly fisherman's mecca. In the summer, you'll also actually see us drive around in this antique RV that we lovingly call the Mellow Yellow, which is basically a rolling dog crate for our dogs because you can't take them to many places that we fish. So tonight we're going to showcase a few of our favorite rivers, the Firehole, the Madison, and the Henry's Fork. And we'll probably focus a little bit on some of the hatches or some of our favorite hatches of these three streams, and some of the patterns that can be used to imitate them. Because really, at the end of the day, it's all about the insects. They are the basis of our sport. So I'll turn it over to Doug, who's going to start talking about the fire.
Nice picture. Thanks, Dan. Thank you. So I'm going to put a map up here, kind of where we're at. Let's see. Okay. So here we are in Bozeman. It's the busiest airport in Montana. You got all the folks coming in from Yellowstone, and it's probably the cheapest place for anglers to fly into. 90 miles south, we've got West Yellowstone, hour and a half, very easy drive. You got Yellowstone to the west, to the east, and also Idaho over in here. So we're going to start off talking a little bit about the Firehole River. So we've got a map here. And Ernie Schreiber called the Firehole one of the strangest rivers on Earth. And it's because of all these geysers and hot pockets. And you just can imagine, with all of this warm water coming in, and then trout are actually living in this river, it's because of all the springs that come into it. And it's got some pretty nice brown trout, all wild fish, nice rainbows. But the thing about the Firehole, the fish aren't particularly big compared to Western standards. Your average fish is going to be 10 to 12 inches, or up to 14 inches long. And they've actually genetically adapted to the warmer temperatures of the river. So they kind of peter out once they get about 14 or 15 inches long. But they put up pretty good scrap. And we have some great hatches on the river. And we're not going to talk about all the hatches on the rivers tonight. We're just going to highlight a few. Whenever you're visiting these areas, it's always good to do some research, stop in your local fly shop, and talk to the clerks there about what the hatches might be. But the pale morning dun is probably the best hatch on the Firehole River. It's going to be about size 14 to 16 mayfly. They're yellowish in appearance. You always want to have a good selection of flies to imitate them, from nymphs, emergers, and dun patterns, as well as spinners. But you also have a hydropsyche caddis emergence, which is this guy right in here. And you'll usually see a little bit of a caddis emergence slightly before or after the hatch, depending on weather conditions. And one thing you'll have to be familiar with the Firehole is the fact that you do have all of these springs, these hot pockets that are coming to the river. And it does make a dramatic effect on the river. Right behind Brandy here is Midway Geyser Basin. That's where Excelsior and Grand Chromatic Springs are. If you ever see the big springs, picture some springs on the Yellowstone area. It's one or the other of those two, and adds a lot of warm water to the river. So depending on the time of year, you're going to want to fish lower in the river or above the springs itself. We're going to kind of break up the river in a few different areas here. You've got the upper portion of the river, which is the water above Midway Geyser Basin. You've got the middle stretch of the river, which is from Midway Geyser down to Nez Perce, right in here, and the lower part of the river. And again, depending on the time of year you're fishing there, you'll want to vary your locations. Earlier in the season, you're going to have a little bit more higher water, so you're probably going to want to fish lower in the river where the water is a little bit warmer. You're going to have a little bit more consistent hatches. But you're also going to want to look for those hatches. You're not going to just show up and here they are, there's the fish rising all over the place. You're going to have to actually do a little field work, tracking down fish. There's a lot of microhabitats in the river. But there's a lot of pretty browns. You got to have a pretty girl with pretty brown. She's pretty enough, so. Oops. And the fire hole also has a lot of nice riffly water. If you've never done fished wet flies, but fishing a wet fly down and across is a very effective way to fish the fire hole when you don't have a lot of insects hatching, just because there's a lot of caddis in the river itself. So size 14 and 16, simple soft hackle patterns work very, very well. Catch some nice brown trout doing nice rainbows as well. But there are also a lot of nice flat water stretches where you can just walk and stalk rising trout. And when there's nothing going on, take a break, have your lunch, relax a little bit, wait for the hatch to start. And you'll catch some nice fish. We catch some 15, 16-inch fish every year, but that's kind of where they top out in the fire hole. Now, as we move up the river above Midway Geyser Basin, you still have the hot pockets. You still have some nice riffly water, but you also have some nice flat water. This is a picture from Muleshoe Bend, which is probably the most famous spot on the fire hole. Very nice dry fly fishing, very technical fishing, and but it's a very fun place to fish. Nice brown trout. And moving up the river, we fall into the upper portion of around Biscuit Basin. The river kind of tightens up a little bit. It's a little bit smaller water. You want to be a little more careful in your approach. A lot of times we're kneeling, stalking fish, looking for them, looking for those rises along the banks. There's some nice little side channels up there. But in the mornings, you can also have some nice spinner falls in some of these slow stretches. Nice morning, nice evening. You're going to see some spinners, some pale morning dun spinners. A simple hackle spinner or polywing spinner does the trick. One insect you don't probably see a lot in the literature is the Nectopsyche caddis. It's a size 16 to 18 caddis, green body. Some people call them white millers, but they can bring some very nice fish to the surface. We use just patterns like Elkhart caddis. This here is actually called a Brandy's caddis, but something that's got a little bit of hackle on it. You can skin it real well. And it brings up some very nice fish. So a nice 17-inch fish, probably one of the bigger fish we caught that season on the fire hole. Now we're going to talk a little bit about the Madison River, which has been coined the 50-mile riffle. It's got tremendous pocket water, tremendous pocket water style fishing, lots of riffles for us to fish. And looking at Madison, so I mentioned a little bit earlier, with the fire hole here. We got the fire hole in the Gibbon River. We actually formed Madison River inside the park. And that flows into Hebgen Lake, which is this big body of water here. And then you have a short stretch of the Madison, and it flows into Quake Lake, which actually was formed in the 50s from an earthquake where half the mountain came into the river. And then from here we have the 50-mile riffle down to Ennis, Montana. In the park, we've got a lot of nice stretches of flat water, a lot of nice bank fishing, looking for rising trout. Has good hatches. The hatches there are not as consistent as they are in the fire hole. You have to have a little more ideal conditions when fishing there to find the fish up and feeding. But the thing about the Madison in the park is you can find some nicer fish there. You've got resident fish that are 14 to 16 inches, and then you've got fish that are coming up from the Madison, or from the Hebgen Lake that will stay there throughout the season. Nice browns, nice rainbows, nice flat water stretches here. A lot of the people that come to the area think of the upper Madison in the park is for the streamer fishing in the fall. We don't really do a whole lot of streamer fishing anymore. You can for some nice brown trout, nice rainbows. But we will go up in there. We have a nice crummy day on the Madison in the park. We'll look for fish feeding on Baetis mayflies or blooming gulls. and you can find some very, very nice fish doing that. Small patterns, we like to design patterns, something you can see. Dan will talk a little bit more about that in his discussion on Henry's Fork, but very, very important to have some flies. They're small flies, you want to be able to see them. So. Now moving from out of the park, Madison flows into the Hebden Lake, which is really known for its gulper fishing. You get these massive patches of calabatus and tricos, and the fish are just gulping and moving, and you can hear the fish coming towards you. Amazing. We don't like to use low powder. We try to incorporate materials in our flies that allow us to see them. So a lot of times we're making it 50+ foot cast, and seeing a fly like that can be kind of hard. So you see here this little cripple pattern, calabash cripple, got a black wing. Against that glare on the water, you can see that heck of a lot easier. This spinner pattern has got a little black post. This size 16 Griffith snap with black wing, that's what we're going to use for a tricos imitation. Even though the tricos are a lot smaller, they eat that fly. And sometimes when they aren't eating anything, we use a size 14 or 16 flying in, and that can be a ticket. But you get some nice fish, really nice fish, nice rainbows, really nice rainbows, nice brown trout. We see fish with little dogs, and sometimes they need a place to sit. So here I am, we're fishing the upper end of the river, or the river going into Quake, and yeah. But the river flows out of Quake Lake and down into the Madison Valley. The upper 10 miles are what we refer to as the walkway water. A lot of public access above the West Fork of the Madison. You can pretty much fish wherever you want. It's a lot of fishing pressure, but you can walk down or up or down the river and kind of get away with it. Get away from the folks, I guess. Now the salmon fly is the most, I would say probably the most famous hatch for this river by far. The nymph lives for about 3 years. Crawls to the banks, merges into the adults, and then they mate and fall back to the water and create the hatch. There's a lot of different imitations for it. They all work, but we like to fish imitations that are easy to see and float well. Because you're fishing, see this heavier water in here. This is the stuff you're fishing with those big flies. So you want something you can see. Very, very easy, or you're not going to, you just want something you can see. So, but lots of nice rainbows. Your typical fish in the Madison is going to be 15 to 18 inches for rainbows, and you can get some browns up to the 20-inch range. Nice fish. You hear a lot about the salmon fly, but the real king of the Madison River is the hydropsyche caddis. It's basically just a size 16 tan-bodied caddis. And you'll see the mating swarms in the evenings of these caddis along the river.
That's a hatch.
Yeah, it's a hatch. Yeah. Brings up some nice fish too. And she's still a lot prettier than I am. So. But you'll have having just some simple patterns. For the adults, you'll have the adult fishing in the mornings, evenings sporadically. But it's really the evening emergence that brings up the fish. Patterns like this X-caddis here, these X-caddis here are really effective. But a pattern you don't hear a lot of is this guy up in the corner. I kind of alluded to it earlier. But that's a pattern by John Jurczyk called an iris caddis. It's by far the best caddis imitation is. And if I just had one of them, that would be it. There's a mayfly called the Epioris mayfly that you don't hear a lot about. It's kind of a sporadic hatch. It's a warmer water mayfly. And over the last few years, the water in the Madison has warmed up, so the hatches of this evening emergence has been better. And it's a size 14, 16 all mayfly. which you can see. You're gonna see them on this cloud. You always want to have some nice raincoat, rain gear with you. And sometimes we need them for the dogs too. So, and the terrestrial fishing is also good. We'll walk along the banks. We'll spot fish that are feeding next to the bushes and so forth. And a lot of people like to fish hoppers, which is very, very popular outlet. We fish very few of them. Most of our terrestrial fishing is with beetles and crickets, the size 14s, 12s, 14s, and 16s. We probably catch 75 to 80% of fish from terrestrials with just those two patterns there. And the one thing, when you look at the mats and you see all this rough, turbulent pocket water, and that's where do I fish? We fish all the little side areas right in here. The fish don't want to stick in that heavy water. They'll move into that softer stuff, and that's where the bugs are, and that's where they're going to be. Some nice brown trout.
So the last of three rivers that we're going to talk about tonight is the Henry's Fork. And I think if Doug and I had to pick just one river to fish the rest of our lives, this would be the one. I mean, I think it's really the creme de la creme of trout fishing, and it's certainly our favorite. Just to kind of get our bearings here, if we look up here in the left upper right-hand corner, this is West Yellowstone. So technically, the Henry's Fork, which is right down in here, isn't in Yellowstone. It's only probably a 30 to 40 minute drive from town. And the river that part of the river that we're going to focus on is the part that's right down here below Island Park Reservoir. And the Henry's Fork has been called the largest spring creek that we have here, well, probably one of the largest spring creeks we have in the world, but it's actually not a spring creek, it's a tailwater fishery coming out of Island Park Reservoir. And you might have heard the Henry's Fork being referred to as the ranch or the railroad ranch, and this is the water that's in Harriman State Park, and is the section that we like to fish the most. And the first thing I'll tell you about this river is it's big, really big. But the wading is fairly easy, and you can actually cross it in most places, despite the fact this can be up to 100 yards across in a lot of the sections. So fairly easy wading. And the thing that draws the anglers are the hatches. The hatches that are on the Henry's Fork are probably some of the best that you're ever going to see in the world. It has abundant hatches, a wide variety of different types of hatches. And here we have a few friends sitting by the bank waiting for a hatch. And the one thing I'll say about the Henry's Fork is it is a very moody river, and the fishing revolves around the hatches. So if there's no hatches or no bugs, you can go home with no fish. And so I would say, hey, if you do want to fish the Henry's Fork, it's a place that you have to be prepared for not even, catching fish or maybe not even making a cast. So the fishing is really kind of a part or is really around all the various insect hatches that you're going to see. And because of that, you can spend a lot of time walking the river, looking for rising fish, and oftentimes it's more like hunting than actual fishing. The stream is quite large, and it's not really obvious where the fish are going to be laying. So if they're not rising, it's really hard to tell where they're at. So you really have to wait for the evening or morning rise to start to find your fishing. So if this is a place you want to go and cast, this is not going to be a river for you. It's really hunting. But why do we do it? If an angler wanted to catch a 20-inch or larger fish on a dry fly, this is the best place to do it. All the fish are wild, and even though this is not a great picture of Doug, you can see how thick that fish is. These are the largest river fish that I've ever seen. They're bigger than the fish that are in the bighorn, and also larger than the fish in Missouri. You know, if you typically catch this fish here was 21.5-inch fish that Doug caught, weighed between 4 and 5 pounds, actually probably close to 5 pounds. So if you're lucky enough to catch, fish around 23 inches, you're looking at a 6-pound fish plus. So those are, fish that you commonly associate with, a trout that's living either in a lake or a pond. I mean, these fish are large. And they're also quite beautiful. They're all wild fish, beautiful spots. So when you do catch one of these fish, it really makes up for it. Question? No question? So if you do have a question or need to get them to stretch your legs, feel free to stop me. So the first, hatch we probably talk about, or that you might have heard about with the Henry Sport, you've done a little bit of reading, is the green drake. And it probably gets, I would say, the most notoriety on the Henry Sport, and it probably brings the largest amount of people or anglers to the river. And this is a large mayfly. You're looking at a size 10, 2x long hook to imitate it. And you're going to find the best populations of these drakes actually in some of the faster moving water up around Last Chance. You can kind of see the buildings in the background. And some of the imitations that we actually like to use for are either a low floating emerger or even a floating nymph. And those of you that aren't familiar with floating nymphs, that's something that Doug and I actually, we spend a lot of time fishing these types of patterns. And the one thing about a floating nymph is it can be a little more difficult to see. But the one thing is the fish do not refuse them over, say, a large or a high riding gun. So even though they're a little more difficult to see, it's we're capturing moderate distances and so forth, so you can actually see these flies pretty well. And here's Doug with a nice Henry Sport rainbow, and you can see the faster moving water behind him. And here's a picture of my wife Annabelle with a nice trout that she caught along the bank. And that's one thing to think about when you do fish the Henry Sport, that you want to be mindful of the fish around the bank. They can often be in some of that thinner water, thinner margins around the bank, feeding on various mayflies and caddis flies and so forth. So the common thing is just to kind of want to get out there and wade through the water, but you really have to be mindful when you get there, because oftentimes the fish can be right around those thinner margins around the banks. Another insect that really draws some of the crowds is the brown drake. This also is a large mayfly. You're typically going to be seeing or using patterns of size 10 or even size 8, 2x long hook. And this is unlike the green drake, this is an evening hatch. And you typically see emergences of these brown drakes anywhere from probably about 7 in the evening to dark, where as with the green drake, it's more of a morning emerger, and you're going to see those flies in the water from probably 10 o'clock to say about 1. And you're going to find the best emergences of the brown drakes in the slower sections, which is kind of in contrast to the green drake. So the sections, say around Millionaires or Bonefish Flats, which are popular fishing spots in the river, and that's because these brown drakes are a burrowing mayfly, and they actually prefer the siltier bottoms that we see in those stretches. And like the green drake, we prefer floating nymph. I mean, they just do not refuse that, and that's the fly there on the right-hand side. But a standard emerger type pattern, or in this case, a soft tackle emerger that's there on the left-hand side can be a great pattern as well. Now this is I guess what I would say the smaller cousin to both the green and brown drake, and this is the small western green drake, or the flavolini, or just simply the flab. And while this insect doesn't get the same or draw the same amount of folks as the larger drakes, this actually can present a lot better fishing opportunities to the angler. And like the brown drake, you're going to see these in the evening, typically from about 5 to 9 o'clock. And like the green drake, the best flab water is some of the upper range sections into Last Chance, Idaho. And you can just really catch a nice fish during those hours. And like I said, the flab fishing, which actually probably can last up to a month or so. So it just, even though it's not as distinguished or as popular as the green drake fishing, actually can be a lot better fishing. We still use some of the similar types of patterns for, floating nymphs up there on the right-hand side, or various emergers here on the left, are all going to work well. This is a size 14 mayfly, so a little bit smaller than the green drakes. Looks very similar to green drake, but it's just a little bit smaller in size. And the last insect I'll spend some time talking about is the Baetis mayfly. Doug touched upon that with the Upper Madison. And, like the flab, this is a mayfly that doesn't get quite the same amount of attention as the drakes, and primarily because it's small. So we're looking at size 20 and 22 invitations, so it's much more difficult to fish. And because of that, it doesn't draw the same amount of folks, but I would tell you that this is probably the best hatch on the river. But it occurs in the fall, and the water this time is at the lowest it's going to be for the year. So the fishing is pretty technical and pretty difficult. So you might find yourself using a longer leader, and you're going to be using finer tippet. So typically we're using a 6X tippet fishing. We'll go up Baetis fish. But again, I think it's some of our favorite fishing, and this hatch is typically you're going to see it in late September, kind of going through October. And just like many mayfly species, the best hatches are going to be on the crummiest and darkest days. And Doug and I get quite excited when we see it snowing or raining, which just seems a little odd, but just like most mayfly species, the best Baetis hatches are going to occur on those crummy days. So you want to make sure you have a good raincoat, a pair of waders that aren't leaking, and a nice hat, because if you don't, you might really not enjoy this fishing too much. Some of the patterns that we like for these smaller mayflies are just simple ties that we can see. So a pattern that has a black wing, like the fly here on the left-hand side, makes it much easier to see it, especially against those low light conditions with that silver glare that you often get on the water. So having a fly with a really dark or a black wing certainly makes it much easier to see that fly. And when you can see your fly, you have a lot more confidence of it. When you're fishing in these difficult situations, a little bit of confidence really goes a long way. And here's a couple of our favorite patterns. So again, we have a floating nymph there on the left-hand side, and the fly that's on the right is a fly that was developed by our friend Kent Takata. We call it the TK Emerger, which is kind of an emerger slash floating nymph style pattern, but again, it has that black wing on it and a black foam pad. And despite its small size, it's actually pretty easy to see. And one more nice picture of the fish when the Henry's work, and this is kind of why we do it. The fish are large, and despite technical situations that you encounter there, and the difficulty in catching a fish, one fish there makes it all worthwhile for us. So if you're thinking about going to the Yellowstone area, fishing the Firehole, the Madison, or the Henry's Fork, I think rods and the 3 to 6 weight category will suit you well. If you had to have one rod to take with you, 9 foot 5 weight would probably be a pretty darn good choice. And I will say, if you're going over to the Henry Sport, you're probably going to want to have a little bit longer leader than maybe what you're used to. We typically start the season out with a 12-foot leader, and as the season progresses, work on up to 15-foot leader, taper to 6X. And I would say if you could take one thing from the slideshow tonight, this would be it. We often see guys walking up the stream with a $1,500 outfit, and, $500 pair of waders, and a $20 pair of sunglasses. Doesn't make any sense. Your eyes are the most important asset you have while you're fishing. It's not the rod, it's not the reel, it's not the line, it's your eyesight. You have to be able to see the fish, and you got to take care of your eyes. So, I would recommend that you get at a minimum, get a couple good pair of sunglasses. You don't have to have a whole basket of sunglasses like Brandy here. I think she has a little bit more, idea of being a little more fashionable on the river, but, having a good yellow pair of sunglasses for those low light conditions and a pair of copper or brown or rose-colored lenses will suit you well. So, at a minimum, I would say you probably would want to invest in those two colors, and I think you can probably cover most of the situations pretty well. And if you're looking to do a little more reading about the area, Craig and John wrote some very good flight time, or some very good fishing books and flight time books about the area, fishing Yellowstone hatches and the patterns of Yellowstone. They wrote probably the gold standard of hatch, descriptions and stuff and the patterns that are fished in the area. And then the book that Craig wrote, The Cleat Mall and Arrow, the Yellowstone Fly Fishing Guide, is a really excellent guide to fishing the rivers in Yellowstone Park. So some really great books there. And if you're looking to do a little reading on Henry Sport, the book that John McDaniel wrote was probably my favorite of the rivers that were, or the books that were wrote about the river. So these are certainly, you don't have to go in and read everything about the area, but if you're looking to do a little bit of research, these are a few books that we recommend that you read. So for the last few minutes, John Young did want us to talk a little bit about rod design. And, so we'll kind of keep this a little bit at a high level. I know it's starting to get a little late, and I don't want to lose too many of you here. But one gentleman like Jim that had a great influence on us was an angler by the name of Paul Brown. And Paul was a legendary angler in the Yellowstone area, and he also designed a number of rods for the Stenwick Rod Company. I'd be shocked if you'd never heard of him before, but he was probably one of the greatest single anglers that ever fished in the area. And a lot of the stuff that you've read out of Craig or John's books actually originated with Paul. He was a mentor to both of them. So he was an incredible angler, and as John Jursek, who's probably one of the finest fly casters on the planet, will tell you, Paul was one of the best casters he's ever seen. So he was really a good angler, a good caster, and a fabulous fly tyer. And he had a lot of influence on a lot of the anglers in the Yellowstone area, and on us as well. So, one thing that as Everett and Greg were talking about, Doug and I actually started a rod company about 2 or 3 years ago, kind of mimicking some of Paul's rods. He specialized in making longer, light action rods for this technical type of dry fly fishing that we see out there. And one thing that Paul used to say is that the ability of a rod to bend is what gives it its power. And if we further quote Paul, what he would say is, for example, a broomstick has great strength, but virtually no power. It has no power because it does not bend. The secret of power in a rod is that the rod must bend to an optimal degree to be most efficient. When a rod bends during the casting stroke, it stores power and or velocity, which is in turn imparted to the line. If the rod does not bend, this stored power, velocity, is absent, and a lack of it must be made up by the caster. So what does this mean? It means if your rod isn't bending efficiently at a certain distance, the deficiency of the caster must be made up by you. We've got a number of, here's an image of some various bends that Paul had depicted. And what I would say about these is, probably most of you are familiar with what is called a progressive taper. And a progressive taper is which is number 3 on this image here. But progressive taper is basically a rod where once the load increases, the bend increases, working down the rod from the tip. And I would say that the first 3 bends here are all kind of various flavors of the progressive taper. And most of those are, most of the rods today are kind of falling into that first bend, which Paul has labeled kind of a steep taper, or a triangular taper. And, if we were to kind of flip that around, we would have what's called, the Ritz or parabolic taper, where you have most of the bending occurring in the butt section of the rod, and you have a firm middle and tip section. So at the end of the day, what this means is basically, you're going to have to kind of consider the way the rod is bending, because that's what's giving the rod its action. So it's just as important as the amount of the bend or the amount of bend that you're seeing in a rod. So what do we look for in a good rod? Well, I would probably say the first thing is kind of a little bit of a geeky thing, and that's, conformance to the design parameters. And, basically what that means is, a designer comes and he does something, designs the rods to do X, does something. Whether it be, if you're fishing deep water, then you would want to make a rod that's longer in nature, because you're going to be, wading deeply, and having a rod that's longer certainly makes it a lot easier to do that. Whereas if you're fishing a smaller stream, you want a shorter rod, maybe a lighter rod. So, some sort of variables that you're trying to achieve with the rod. I used to kind of have this idealistic notion of this. I would tell you that most of this is really, in practice, doesn't occur, because most rods are really made to sell. And, it's more based on marketing anymore. And the reason why I say that is because most of the best anglers I know do not fish rods of today. They're fishing rods from 20 to 30 years ago. And that includes some of the world champion casters. Chris Gorge, who's a world champion caster, actually uses an old Fenwick H&G from 1976. And he's one of the best in the world. So we talked a little bit about power and stiffness, but I will say, generally, I think that most rods of today are too stiff. And as Paul said, it's the ability of the rod to bend that gives us its power. So stiffness is what gives the rod control. So you introduce stiffness in areas of the rod where you need control. Another thing that we look for in a good rod is smoothness. Does the rod bend evenly? Is there a softer or stiffer section in the rod that makes the rod feel disjointed? So having a rod that's smooth really makes it a much nicer casting instrument. And we also look for an integrated action, so a bend that is smooth and integrated from the tip to butt. That's important to us. One thing that we also like is, how the rod feels in the hand. So does the rod feel heavy in your hand? And, you might have heard people talk about swing weight and so forth. So we try to design features in a rod that makes them feel good when they're in your hand. We also like to consider aesthetics, and I would say that Doug and I are probably a little more traditional than many anglers. We like to build rods with nickel silver components and slide band reel seats and a nice shaped grip. So those are really for us important things that we consider in a rod. And I'll say
Fanatical on grip shapes.
yeah, we were a little. It's funny that Jim says that. Sometimes I'm amazed that he put up with us in the class. I mean, these two young kids, and we were pretty particular about things, but he just took it in stride. And
You take it down another 1,000.
yeah. But we're a little particular about the grip shape, and one thing that Doug and I do like is sort of what I would call like a Wells or in the case of our rods, kind of a grip that Paul used to like, which actually have a very crisp stop at the end of your grip for your thumb. And for those of you that are kind of unfamiliar with that grip, a Wells or this style of grip that has that stop is probably the most comfortable style of grip. And after we got started using it, it was hard for us to go back to a cigar. So sometimes some anglers say, oh, this doesn't look like that classic cigar grip. I encourage just kind of be a little open-minded and try it. You might actually like it a lot better. And finally, is the rod fun? I think that's something that we oftentimes don't think about. Does the rod bring that smile to your face? And for us, I mean, this is an enjoyable sport, or it should be enjoyable, and casting is a part of that. So it should be fun.
Got a question for you.
Yeah.
You talk about how does the rod feel in your hand?
Yeah.
Putting a large reel on it is going to change it drastically. What do you recommend as far as reel size on the rod that you're offering right now?
Well, I would say I would put the lightest weight reel that you can. I'm not a real firm believer in balancing the rod, but I would tell you if you put a heavy reel on a rod, it would actually make the tip feel lighter than it actually is. And if you think that's BS, what I would say is go out and cast a rod for 10 minutes and then put the reel in your pocket and see how different it feels. So, with Doug and I tend to use lighter weight reels, anything that's 4 ounces or less. So for us, that kind of narrowed things down for a long time with a lot of the modern reels. Large rubber reels, a lot of them are quite heavy. So, I would say probably in the last 8 or so years, they've actually started coming down a weight. Sage and Lamson offer a number of reels that are in the 4 ounce or lighter category. So I would say I would encourage you to probably stick with a lighter reel. We're also reel junkies, so that doesn't stop me from putting a 5.5 ounce Hardy Perfect on my rod. But I know that's going to affect the way that the rod feels.
Let me add something. One thing you have to worry about, not on balance, but is if your rod is butt heavy, and you're doing fishing with wet flies, where the feel is a big thing. When it's butt heavy, you keep trying to push the rod tip down, and now you're losing contact with the fly. So it's more sensitive if you have the other way around, the lighter weight.
Right. That's a good point, Jim. I guess the last slide I have here is, how would you want to select a rod? And if somebody were asking, I'd probably say, stick to the lower or more moderate action rods. And and I think that's the way that the rod industry has gone. Most of the offerings anymore are fairly stiff, and it's been marketed. Stiffness has been marketed as something that's an attribute to the rod, or as something that should be desired. And that's not always the case. And many of these rods are made to be sold or based on, marketing and not necessarily based on fishing. So if you do get a chance, I would say stick with the more moderate action rods and cast them at a distance that you're going to be fishing. When Doug and I were working for Blue Ribbon, the common tendency for a guy was to get out and see how far he could open up. And gosh, this rod casts 70 feet, it's a good rod. Well, I would tell you, a rod that casts well at 70 feet will not cast well at 30 feet. It is impossible. So, can it do it? Sure. But the question is, does it do it well? So you want a rod that does it well for the distances of the fishing that you're going to be encountering. And that's why I would say, the more moderate action rods are better fishing tools. And along the same lines, don't be afraid to overline the rod. It's kind of ironic that a lot of the fly fishing, fly line manufacturers have kind of keyed on this a little bit, but they actually are selling lines that are full or half size heavy. And when Rio first started doing this, gosh, probably 15 years ago, they came out with a line that was actually a full size heavier than what they were telling people it was. And guess what? It was the #1 selling line that they had that year. So people were buying 5 weight, and it was actually a 6. But their stiff rods actually felt better with the heavier line. And so if you do get a chance to go cast a few rods, ask what line's being used. Or even better yet, maybe bring your own line. That way you can kind of control it and, use a line that you're familiar with, one that's true to weight. And finally, I guess in conclusion, I'd probably say, we all have a price, and just because it's $1,000 rod does not mean it's any better, than a $200 rod. And I actually think that the best trout rod on the market is the Remington Classic Trout, which is a $150 rod. But I would take that rod over every single other rod I've ever cast from any other manufacturer, because it's one that bends and it fishes better at most of the distances that we encounter as fishermen. So with that, I guess that's kind of all we have here tonight for you guys, and we'll entertain any questions you have.
The first question is, are you guys using a lot of CDC? It looked like you're using foam on a lot of those, or are you using CDC?
I'm not a real big fan of CDC, to be honest with you, Max. It can be a little temperamental with fishing. I would say that Doug and I probably prefer tying flies with foam in this case, and tied delicately, and also using hair. And hair like deer hair and elk hair, they float really well, and you spend less time manicuring than say a CDC fly. But I will say that one hair that we really like to use is caribou hair. And it's not as sterile as, say, deer hair, so we use it a lot in some of our caddis patterns. It kind of creates a buggier effect than deer hair. And it's actually the material that's used in the Improved X caddis, which is one of our flies. And we actually started tying those for the shop for the first year. That was our #1 selling fly.
I got one other question. Did Dottie interview your wives before she gave you approval?
We did pretty well. I mean, despite our shortcomings, I can't believe sometimes that we did as well as we did.
Oh, we like them better.
But kind of back to your question about the CDC. So if you are a fan of CDC flies, one trick that I would recommend is actually putting a rubber band on your vest and hooking the fly onto that rubber band and plucking it, if you will.
Yeah.
Actually dries that fly remarkably well. It's kind of a trick that a lot of the New Zealand guides use, and actually one of my friends has brought out a product in the last month called a fly banjo, where it's a silicone band that you connect to your vest and hook the fly to it and pluck it. It dries it remarkably well. I mean, it almost brings it back to new condition.
Yeah. Thank you.
Any other questions?
Oh, you mentioned hot pockets early on. What kind of temperature difference are you talking about between a hot pocket and a regular water? 10 degrees, 20 degrees?
Well, some of them will be, you can go in and, you know, if it's a cold day, you can go in and kind of sit in them. You know, there's a lot along the river you can kind of do that. Some of the other ones you can't do where they're, if you stick your finger there, it's going to burn off. And there's people that fall in some of those hot pockets every year and they die. When they go and try to take a picture, they fall in, and you can't get them out fast enough. They're boiled. So there's it varies very tremendously between the temperature in some of them.
Question. The hatches that you were talking about, how long do they last? Is it weeks? Months?
Depends.
It depends. You know, the Bay's mayfly blue all that Doug talked about initially is a multi-brood species, so it has several generations season, if you will. So you can encounter Betas all season long, you know, under the right conditions. But you know, you generally do see those the best early on in the season, and late in the season.
You know, for like the pale morning duns, you're typically going to be a window of, on some of the rivers, it can be about a month where you see the primary pale morning dun hatches, and then you'll see a little bit after that, but they tend to be a little bit smaller on some of the rivers. So it could be maybe 2 months of actually pale morning dun fishing. Now the drakes that Dan talked about, most of those, like the brown drakes, it's usually, you're only going to really encounter maybe 2 or 3 days where it's really good. And then you might have a week there where you see the bugs. The green drakes are maybe 2 weeks. It varies every year. Some years you can have maybe a month of some of these bugs that are typically only a week or 2. The caddis fishing on the Madison, it's really about 3 weeks long, typically. The best fishing is usually the first couple weeks in July. And then it just kind of wanes a little bit after that. But it depends. Every river, every river, every season, it's different. And some years you see bugs that you haven't seen in 10 or 15 years. You know, in the high water years, in the Madison, the park, you have a really good gray drake spinner fall in the mornings. It's tremendous. I mean, it really brings up some really big fish. But we haven't seen probably a really great drake hatch up there in maybe 20 years, 25 years. But when you get those high water years, for whatever reason, those bugs flourish and you have great hatches. So and you know, we've been fishing Yellowstone for 30 years now, and it's been different every year. And when we first started fishing there, we have patches that we fish that we don't fish anymore. You know, some of the rivers have warmed up a little bit. And like I was talking about, the Epuris on the Madison, you didn't see that then. The river there will actually warm up a degree or 2 and you see those bugs. So it depends almost every year. You know, the best advice is, you know, kind of familiar yourself with the hatch charts, look at them, but then go in and talk to the folks to see what's actually going on. And they can also point you to maybe certain stretches of the river where you might see better hatches than others. Thank you.
Was nothing better than taking your dry file, seeing that for sure is a beautiful thing out there. But on those days when there are no hatches, will the fish predate? Will you take any form of streamer on any of those rivers?
On streamer fishing, yeah, you can fish streamers on most of them. The Henry's Fork is a little hard just because of all the weed growth in the river. Earlier in the season, you can do that, but yeah, you can streamer fish on almost all the other ones as well.
You know, especially early on when the rivers are high and muddy, you know, fishing a dead drift streamer, you know, along like some of these banks along the Madison, really can be really effective. It's not, you know, pretty fishing, it's more kind of ham and egg fishing, but you can some of those high water conditions, you still catch a lot of fish, fishing streamers.
And you know, the streamer fishing has really been popular. I mean, the last 5 to 10 years, there's a lot. I mean, especially, a lot of the younger anglers. I mean, when we go out fishing, you see, you know, these guys that are in their 20s. No, we're not in our 20s anymore. But a lot of them are fishing streamers, and it's very, very popular. I mean, Kelly Gallups out in our area, and he's popularized a lot of the streamer fishing on the Madison. But I will tell you that, you know, there's a lot of, with this fishing that we do, there's a lot of fish that those people never see. We'll walk on, we're doing a lot of sight fishing. We're actually fishing to the fish before we cast it. And even in a big rough river like the Madison, you can walk along and see a 18 or 19 inch brown, sitting there and actually feeding on nymphs. It's really cool fishing. But a lot of those people, they're not interested. And we get a lot of people that fish, a lot of nymphing. And if you're really into nymphing, the Madison River is a great place to do it. It's probably got some of the most interesting pocket water, that you can find anywhere. Great nymphing water. But again, the people that do a lot of that, they're either walking on the fish or they never see those fish. So they never fish them. So the fish that we're fishing to, most of the younger anglers in our area they never see them. They never bother with them. Yeah.
I mean, the one thing is, the rivers and creeks out there are relatively pristine compared to here, or, even Pennsylvania for that matter. So that we still have very good insect hatches. And, for us, that's really the draw, is to go out, figure out when the insects are going to be hatching and, the fish are going to be most active. And that's really the thing that really gets our blood churning. One of our friends actually calls, dinosaurs, because we fish like that, the old classic style fishermen. When Doug and I first started working at the shop, a lot of the fishermen there were like that. Nowadays I would say they're kind of a rarity. It's more of, guys wanting to go out and, catch as many fish as they can, nymph or string fish, whatever it is, when they would just walk past all these other rising fish. And sometimes I just don't understand it, but then again, gosh, it leaves a little bit of water for us to fish. So that's not a bad thing as well. And for us, having that visual style fishing, seeing the fish rise or seeing the fish, that's just the style of fishing that we like, and it's just the most enjoyable form for us. But that doesn't mean that has to be that way for everybody. I mean, there's so many other types of fishing to be had out there, and whatever style of fishing is most enjoyable to you is what I would say to do. Whatever makes you most happy. And being from Montana, or being in Montana and having all those rivers and streams to choose from and great hatches and stuff, I mean, it's really trout mecca, and you've got a lot of opportunity there to really do whatever you want. Hey, Jim.
What type fly line do you guys like to use?
Well, I would say for trout fishing, anything that's true to weight. So meaning that it's within whatever the variance is for the standard.
For a double taper? Or?
Yeah, so we prefer a double taper line for the most part. And one reason we like a double taper is the fact that you can flip it around. So you basically get two lines in one. And the other thing I like about a double taper, especially for fishing or making longer casts on Hebgen Lake, is I can pick it up and not have to stripping the thinner running line to make a cast. I can, if I'm fishing 50 or 60 feet, and these fish are gulping and rising in succession, and he doesn't take my fly, I can pick it up and take one false cast and lay it back down. And that's something you cannot do with the weight forward. And I think that the fly line manufacturers would love you to believe that a weight forward line is the way to go, but I don't get it. I mean, our John wrote an interesting article for Hatch magazine called "Wither of the Double Taper," and if you're really interested about double tapers, I encourage you just to Google that. I mean, he has some really good points about why you should be fishing a double taper line instead of a weight forward line. But for me, the biggest thing is you can reverse it, and if you're making a long cast, I can pick it up without having to strip in the running line. So, and go ahead, yeah.
What are the best months to fish the Madison in the park?
Gosh, I would say in the fall, which probably the Madison draws the most anglers in the fall with when the browns and rainbows start to run up out of Hebgen Lake, and many of the pools are named. You've got the Barnes Holes and Cable Car Run and a host of others, and So some of those, deeper runs and pools, if you're fishing in the fall, those migrating fish are going to sit better in some of that water. And if you're a dry fly fisherman, I would say, just cover spots. Drive up to, if you're going out and trying to, fish the pale morning dun emergence, I would say, just go up there in the morning and look for rising fish and look for bugs, and sometimes with dry fly fishing, it can be a little, moody, if you will. You can be in one stretch and not see any bugs, and, go a quarter mile, half mile of the river and see a lot of bugs.
But it's only, the Madison and the Fire are only really gonna fish, in the park, we're only gonna fish till about July 4th. Then the water just gets too warm. So if you're wanting to, come up in there and fish for this, you want to come up in June and fish. And, later in the fall, you're looking at, the middle of September, through October, depending on how well you can take some of the cold weather,
When you say fall, are you talking September or October?
October, yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, the park now closes on October 31st. So that's the latest you can fish it. Now, you used to fish it the first weekend in November. But the longer you go, more fish you'll get up from Hepburn into the river.
And the one thing, if you are a dry fly fisherman in the fall, you have all that dry fly water yourself. Most of the guys will, be down in the named runs trying to catch a 30-inch brown. I don't understand why it draws so many people there when the same size fish that are living in the lake and living down in the Madison River. We go down and guys will talk, well, geez, kind of, half a dozen fish in the Madison. It's like, well, you go down lower Madison, fish more interesting water, and catch 3 times the amount of fish. So it's, that lure of catching a giant fish, and occasionally, you'll see guys catching 8 to 9 pound fish out of the upper Madison. These fish that are migrating out of the lake, but those fish are few and far between. Most of the fish that you're going to catch in Madison are the same fish as in the lake, typically 16 to 20 inches. They're the same size you'll see down in Madison below the lakes, but more of them.
You typically fish a single fly or 2 flies?
It depends, but one thing, fishing a dropper fly off the dry is very popular anymore, especially people that have, you can see the fly, see the dry fly go under, and the fish ate my net. One thing you have to remember when you fish 2 flies is you will never get as good a drift with 1 fly, or with 2 flies as you can with 1. You can't do it. I don't care how good you are or what you can do. You can't do it. You can always get a better drift with 1 fly as opposed to 2. And the only time we will fish 2 flies like that is if we're in a particular situation where we know the fish is feeding on nymphs, and for whatever reason, we're having a hard time seeing that nymph. And we're seeing the fish, and we'll actually do a dry dropper rig. It's gotten, that's a very popular way to fish, especially in Montana. You guys got hopper droppers, and they do all this stuff. But the thing is that you will never get as good a drift with 2 flies as you can with 1. It's just, you don't. So, and if we're really trying, when we're fishing on the Henry's Fork, sometimes our typical tippet is 4 feet. Sometimes we're going to 5 feet to get a drift in some of the places. I mean, sometimes it's not easy, and any variable you add into that just makes it harder on you. So we don't do a lot of that ourselves, but on the lake it can be very effective. A lot of those anglers, when you're fishing to the golfers, it's very precise fishing. When the fish are cruising, sometimes they're kind of randomly cruising. You're trying to guess where they might rise next. So it's hard, and sometimes you're making a lot of casts in front of that fish before they might take that. A lot of anglers will actually put a little nymph behind it because it doubles your chances there. It doesn't affect the drift, but that can be one situation where you can actually do pretty well. A lot of them do it anymore. A lot of them fish a dry dropper rig out there because of that.
So, for me, I never do it. So it just cuts kind of, it makes, kind of cuts some of the security out of fly fishing for me. And if it means, you know, I catch less fish out of it by not fishing 2 flies, then hey, that's okay. But that's just the way that I, you know, prefer to fish. So, I also hate getting a second fly, you know, either hooked in the fish when you're fighting them, you know, or in your net. So it's just a pain in the butt.
And you know, when you're fishing a river, some of these rivers they're weedy, so that second fly makes it. If the fish runs in the weed, it's a lot harder to get them out. I mean, there's some of these big fish on the Henry's Fork especially. I mean, you know, on the bays and stuff, we might hook a fish that's, you know, you hook a fish on a 5-pound fish that's size 20 or 22. We're actually, a lot of times, Ben doesn't more than, we use barbs on those flies, little micro barbs on the flies, because we'll give that fish slack, and we'll actually walk out to where that fish is at and try to kick him out. You know, with our net. And, you know, I had one, you know, a few years, probably 5 years ago, I had to do that 8 times to a fish. I was using a 9-foot 2-weight fly rod, 3-weight fly rod, but that fish was 6 pounds. And yeah, so you know, having another fly on there would have made that. I wouldn't be able to do it. You know, I probably hooked myself in the leg or something.
Anything else? Any more questions?
Is that microbar legal in the park?
No, it's actually Dan got a ticket last year, I think, on the Henry's Fork for that.
It's not. Yeah, it's not legal in the Henry's Fork, but you know, I fish a microbar on my flies, and as Doug said, you know, they don't come out, and we're also not fishing to small fish. Doug and I only fish to a fish that's 16 inches or better, and you know, those micro barbs are pretty darn easy to take out of there to begin with. And, you know, I was, you know, talking to a guide, and he was talking about how many, you know, fish they landed probably 30% of the fish. I was like, that doesn't happen. I mean, you know, there's a lot of, you know, I think there's a lot of times that, you know, are fishing, you know, barbless hooks, you know, on the Madison or the Firehole, these rivers where, you know, the weeds aren't really a concern. But over in the Henry's Fork, they're a huge concern, and especially in the fall. I mean, you have rafts and rafts of floating weeds coming down, and it's not uncommon to have to actually drop your rod, get all that mess off there, and continue fighting fish. And I don't know how many times that happens. And you know, if that's the only fish that you've seen that day and hooked, and he gets off, I mean, that's a hard thing, you know. That's a hard thing. That's a hard thing to accept. And you know, these flies come out of a big fish like that. They come out pretty easily. So you know, I mean, there was some debate in the angling community how, you know, that maybe even these barbless hooks were actually causing more damage to the fish. And one thing I will say that is, despite all this, you know, anglers are. I don't know how many fish we catch that, you know, have missing mandibles or you know, ripped up mouths, and I think a lot of it comes from people just being too rough with these smaller fish. You know, they catch a small fish and just really manhandle it and end up ripping their mouth off or you know, whatever. And, but we are not, you know, so you know, be kind to those little fish, and you know, they get bigger. And so yeah, I mean it's. So yeah, I mean, I'm breaking the law, but you know, Paul used to fish barbs too. So you know, we talked about Paul here. He was the best fisherman in the area. He fished them as well, and you know, so I think in in the right situations, I think they're you know, totally fine.
How much was your fine?
Well, he gave me a warning. I mean, I could have, you know, I knew he was coming down, and I could have tried to pinch it down, but I was like, you know, if he finds me,
How
fines
do
me.
they check it?
He looked at my fly.
No, but do they like put it in a fabric so that it pulls some?
He looked at it. For me, I've gotten a lot older. I have a hell of a time even telling it's on there. I mean, these are small barbs. You know, the Partridge hook that we use and the Daiichi 1180. You know, they have a really small barb, and again, some of the new mustad hooks have a small one as well. So I have a hard time even seeing them. You know, he looked at it. He saw that little barb on there, and he was like, "Oh, you know, you can't fish barbs here." He was like, "Do you fish here often?" And I was like, occasionally, right? I tell them there's probably 60 a day that I've been there that day. But, so
Twice a weekend.
right, so it's, I would just encourage you to kind of, make up your own mind and do what makes, the most sense to you. And, but I think that some of the barbless stuff, has been a little bit overblown, because I still see a lot of fish with, mouth problems, missing mandibles and stuff like that. And,
Those aren't from barbs.
right. Yeah. I don't know. I'm one of them.
How many boxes of flies do you typically take out with you?
Well,
that's a good
And
question.
repeat flies.
I would tell you that Doug is probably the exception. We have 14 fly boxes in there. Yeah.
So I have one box that's probably has 300 to 400 dozen flies in it. And all my boxes are kind of like that. And I have about maybe 10 to 10 boxes I keep reading. Now, Dan is probably a little bit more on the other extreme. He's using his flies for years, and he's got a little thing here. It's like, I'll save that one, this one. It's like, I just usually throw that stuff away. To my defense, I mean, Doug and I are really busy, so, I still tie flies though.
yeah, but, so we have our day jobs working 40 to 50 hours a week, and then we spend a lot of our free time, in the winter and spring and making fishing rods, and so, we're real busy. So I haven't actually, I don't tie like I used to. I mean, Doug and I, we're commercial fly tiers for 13 years, and in fact, when Doug got out of school, he tied professionally for 1 year, when you tie 1,500 dozen for 6 months or something like that. So. Yeah, so probably my decision is a little bit more on, necessity. Certainly when you flip open my box, you can probably hear the wind, go through it. But I typically have 5 boxes I carry with me, and but I've become really good at recycling flies, as Doug said. And I'm a little anal about it too. Once a fly comes out of my box, it never goes back. I have a separate box for all of my used flies. They're all in one box. So I don't like to mix my used and my new flies.
But even though I've got a lot of flies on me, I'd be crying if I lost one of those boxes. But that doesn't mean that you can't go out there with just a box and a box full of flies and take care of a lot of your fishing needs. You don't have to have boxes and boxes of flies. Going in and tying just a few basic patterns, and using that kind of stuff. I mean, we make a lot of deal about flies, and this fly is better than that fly. Dan and I design. When we just looking at designing some of the flies we did, that we're doing that for us, so we can. It helps us fish better. Those fish do not care. I always say, fish are fish. People are stupid. I mean, because that type of stuff is made up for selling flies, and this fly is better than that fly. This has this one. The fish don't care. They care about you getting that fly in front of them when they want to, and that's the most important thing. By far. It's we try to blame. Hey, look, I didn't catch that fish because I had the wrong fly on, or I didn't have this fish. You didn't catch that fish because of you. Whenever you can do something, it's like examine why you didn't catch this, because of something you did makes you a better angler. And that's how you learn to catch that fish next time.
Great job.
Anything else?